What is the price of a memory? For some, it is the ink on a faded photograph, the scent of a forgotten perfume. For others, it is the silent, astronomical sum printed on the bottom of a tasting menu at a restaurant where memories are manufactured for the wealthy. But what if the truest price was not paid in dollars, but in dignity? What if an act of quiet courage in the face of public humiliation was not merely a good deed, but the final, decisive move in a game for a multi-billion-dollar empire? This is the story of Clara Maeve, a young woman whose life had become a ledger of sacrifices, serving fantasies of culinary perfection to people who would never know her name. It is the story of a ghost at the feast, an old man in a threadbare coat, adrift in a sea of crystal and silver. And it is the story of a single, extravagant meal, an act of defiance so profound it should have been career suicide, but instead became the final interview for the most important job in the world. Stick with us as we reveal how a 22-year-old waitress, facing eviction and the crushing weight of her brother's illness, unknowingly challenged a titan of industry, and in doing so, inherited a legacy he thought was lost forever. L'Étoile was not a restaurant, it was a theater. Patrons did not simply eat, they bore witness to a performance of wealth. The air, meticulously climate-controlled, smelled faintly of beeswax, white truffle, and the clean metallic scent of money. Sunlight, filtered through soaring, two-story windows overlooking the city's grandest park, was artfully fractured by a constellation of hand-blown crystal chandeliers. The clinking of Villeroy and Boch china against fret linens was the room's hushed applause. For Clara Maeve, L'Étoile was both a gilded cage and a battlefield. At 22, she moved through its opulent spaces with a practiced grace that belied the frantic calculus clicking away in her mind. Her dreams of studying art history, of losing herself in the hushed halls of European museums, were now confined to the sepia-toned pages of books piled by her bedside in a cramped apartment she shared with her younger brother. Reality was the art of the upsell, of discerning a vintage of Bordeaux by its bouquet, of smiling with serene confidence while her feet screamed in their sensible, manager-approved heels. Every meticulously folded napkin, every perfectly polished wine glass was a small step towards the only goal that mattered. Leo, her brother, 16, and all sharp angles and quiet wit, was the sun her universe reluctantly orbited. He was supposed to be worrying about college applications and the awkwardness of first dates. Instead, his world was a circuit of doctor's appointments and echocardiograms, a life lived in the shadow of a congenital heart defect. A complex experimental surgery was his only chance at a normal future, a surgery with a price tag that looked like a telephone number and was deemed elective by their laughably inadequate insurance policy. So Clara worked. She memorized the daily specials, the esoteric flavor profiles, the complex lineage of every cheese on the cart. She became an expert in the subtle language of the rich, the dismissive flick of a wrist, the bored sigh, the quiet power of a Black American Express card. She wore her uniform like armor and her smile like a shield, while the fear for Leo was a cold, constant stone in her stomach. This Tuesday evening was a tableau of L'Étoile's typical clientele, a tech mogul celebrating an acquisition with insufferably loud laughter, a political power couple conducting a frosty, silent negotiation over their Dover soul, a table of heiresses documenting their meticulously arranged plates for social media. Clara moved between them, a silent, efficient ghost, her mind on the second overdue notice from the cardiology clinic tucked inside her locker. Her section was nearly full when Julian Vance, the restaurant's manager, materialized at her side. Julian was a man sculpted from condescension and hair gel. He saw the restaurant not as a place of hospitality, but as his personal fiefdom, and his staff as serfs who constantly threatened its pristine image. "Clara, table 7, he hissed, his voice a low thrum of irritation. "Potential situation. Handle it." He nodded towards a small two-top near the windows, a table usually reserved for the most important guests. A man sat there. He was the visual equivalent of a fork scratching a porcelain plate. In a room of bespoke suits and designer dresses, He wore a dark wool overcoat that was clean but hopelessly outdated, the fabric worn thin at the elbows. His gray hair was unruly, and his face was a tapestry of deep-etched lines. But it was his shoes that truly offended the room's sensibilities. They were scuffed, serviceable leather boots, the kind a man who worked with his hands might wear. He looked less like a patron and more like someone who had wandered in from a forgotten era, searching for a place that no longer existed. Clara felt a familiar prickle of annoyance from Julian's gaze. He expected her to dispose of this anomaly. Politely, of course, but firmly. She picked up a water carafe and two menus, composing her face into its usual mask of pleasant neutrality, and walked toward the table. "Good evening, sir. Welcome to L'Etoile," she said, her voice calm and even. The man looked up, and Clara felt a small jolt. His eyes were a startlingly pale, washed-out blue, clouded with a profound weariness that seemed to absorb the glittering light of the chandeliers. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and was no longer impressed by any of it. He clutched a worn tweed cap in his gnarled hands. "Good evening," he rasped, his voice thin and dry like autumn leaves. He gestured vaguely at the empty chair opposite him. "I'm waiting for my wife, Eleanor." Clara's professional smile softened into something more genuine. "Of course, sir. May I bring you something to drink while you wait?" "Whiskey?" he said, not looking at the extensive, leather-bound drinks list. "Macallan, the old one. Neat." Clara blinked. The Macallan 25 was one of the most expensive spirits they served, a detail this man seemed entirely unaware of, or indifferent to. She nodded. "An excellent choice, sir." As she walked to the bar, she felt Julian's eyes boring into her back. She ignored him. She returned with the whiskey, a generous pour in a heavy crystal tumbler. The old man cradled it in his hands, staring out the window at the darkening park, the city lights beginning to bloom like earthbound stars. He didn't speak. He just sat, lost in a world she couldn't see, waiting for a woman who wasn't coming. For the next hour, he was a silent island in the bustling sea of the dining room. Clara tended to her other tables, describing the provenance of the Wagyu beef and the subtle notes of a Sancerre, but she remained acutely aware of him. He nursed his single glass of whiskey, occasionally taking a small sip. He never checked his watch, never looked toward the door. He just waited. Julian prowled the perimeter of the room, his jaw tight with displeasure. He shot Clara a look that clearly said, "Get rid of him." Finally, summoning her courage, Clara approached the table again. "Sir, I'm sorry to disturb you. Is there anything else I can get for you? Perhaps some bread or an appetizer?" He turned his gaze from the window, his pale eyes focusing on her as if from a great distance. "She loved this view," he said, his voice soft with memory. "We had our first date here, right at this table." He looked down at the empty place sitting across from him. She would have ordered the Coquille Saint-Jacques. Always. Clara's heart gave a small, painful twist. Her own parents had been like that, full of stories and shared rituals. Her father, a history professor, had been the one to instill in her a love for these things, for the stories behind a meal, the history in a bottle of wine. It was his voice she sometimes heard in her head when describing a dish, a bittersweet echo in the noisy restaurant. "It's still on the menu, sir," she said gently. "Our chef's interpretation is quite remarkable." A flicker of something, interest or perhaps just the ghost of it, passed over his face. "Yes," he said almost to himself, "and the Chateau Margaux, the 82. She always said it tasted like history." He looked up at Clara, a direct, challenging look in his tired eyes. "Bring it, the scallops and the wine." Clara's breath caught. The Chateau Margaux 1982 was a legend. The restaurant had exactly 3 bottles left in its cellar. The price for one was nearly $4,000. The scallops were a trifle by comparison. This was no longer an awkward situation. It was a looming financial catastrophe. She glanced over at Julian, who was now standing near the host station, watching them with undisguised alarm. He gave her a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No." Clara turned back to the old man. She saw the fragile hope in his eyes, the desire to grasp a wisp of a memory. She thought of Leo, of the ever-growing pile of bills, of the bone-deep weariness that defined her life. The sensible, rational thing to do was to politely explain that the wine required a pre-authorization, to gently steer him towards a more reasonable choice. It was the only thing to do. But then she looked at his worn hands, his lonely vigil, his quiet determination to relive one perfect moment. In his defiance of the room's cold opulence, she saw a reflection of her own struggle, a quiet insistence on finding beauty and meaning in a world that often felt devoid of both. "Right away, sir," Clara said, her voice steady. She turned and walked toward the sommelier station, feeling Julian's furious gaze like a physical blow. She had just lit a match, and she had a terrible feeling she was about to watch her entire world burn down. The presentation of the Chateau Margaux was a piece of restaurant theater Clara had performed dozens of times, but never with such a leaden sense of dread. The sommelier, a perpetually nervous man named Philippe, handled the bottle as if it were a holy relic, his hands trembling slightly under Julian's hawk-like supervision. Clara stood by, her hands clasped behind her back, as Philippe decanted the legendary wine, its deep garnet color seeming to absorb the light. She served the old man the coquille Saint-Jacques, the seared scallops arranged in a perfect fan on a bed of saffron risotto. He stared at it for a long moment, then picked up his fork and took a single, deliberate bite. He closed his eyes, a faint, sad smile gracing his lips. He took one sip of the wine, then set the glass down. He didn't touch either again. He simply sat with the meal and the wine, as if their presence alone was enough, two ghosts conjured to keep him company. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of tension. Julian assigned another waiter to the remainder of Clara's tables, effectively isolating her. "You will attend to table 7 and table 7 only," he'd ordered, his voice dangerously low, "and you will personally handle the consequences." The message was clear. This was her mess. Her career at L'Étoile was hanging by the thread of this man's ability to pay. Finally, long after the last dessert spoon had been cleared from the other tables, the old man stirred. He signaled for Clara. "The check, please, my dear," he said softly. With a heart that felt like a trapped bird beating against her ribs, Clara went to the point-of-sale system. She typed in the codes, her fingers stiff and clumsy. The final tally glowed on the screen, a number that seemed more like a cruel joke than a restaurant bill. $4,750. She printed the check, slipped it into the small leather folio, and carried it to the table as if she were delivering a death sentence. She placed it discreetly beside his plate. The man opened it. He stared at the number for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then he began to fumble in the pockets of his overcoat. A look of mild confusion crossed his face. He checked his trouser pockets, his movements becoming more deliberate, more searching. He patted the breast pocket of his coat again, his brow furrowing. "Oh dear," he murmured, looking up at her, his pale eyes wide with a carefully constructed embarrassment. I seem to have misplaced my wallet. I am so terribly sorry. I was certain I had it with me." He looked around the table, at the half-eaten scallops and the nearly full decanter of wine. I can come back. I don't live far. I give you my word." Julian, who had been lurking near the service station, overheard. It was the moment he had been waiting for. He strode to the table, his face a mask of cold fury. "That will not be necessary," Julian said, his voice dripping with venom. He didn't even look at the old man. He directed his words to Clara. "Our policy on this matter is perfectly clear. We will be calling the police." The old man flinched, a deep flush of shame creeping up his wrinkled neck. He shrank back in his chair, suddenly looking frail and utterly defeated. "Please," he whispered, "there's no need for that. It's an honest mistake." "Honest mistakes are not my concern," Julian snapped, pulling out his phone. "Theft of services, however, is." In that moment, watching the old man's profound humiliation, Clara felt something inside her break. It wasn't pity. It was a white-hot protective rage. She saw her own fears mirrored in his shame, the terror of not having enough, of being at the mercy of cold, unforgiving systems and men like Julian. This restaurant, with its rules and its exorbitant prices, was suddenly obscene. She stepped between Julian and the table. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Julian stopped, his thumb hovering over his phone's screen. "What did you say, Ms. Maeve?" "I said no," Clara repeated, her gaze unwavering. "You will not call the police. I will handle it." You will handle it? Julian laughed, a short, ugly sound. And how do you propose to do that? Do you have $5,000 in that little apron of yours? Clara's mind raced. Her savings? The money for Leo. It was almost exactly this amount, scraped together over 2 years of double shifts and skipped meals. Every dollar was a drop of blood, sweat, and hope. It was for Leo's future. It was sacred. She looked at the old man slumped in his chair, the picture of defeat. She thought of her father who used to say, "There are things in this world more valuable than money, Clara. Dignity is one of them. Never let anyone take it from you or from anyone else if you can help it." She took a deep breath. "As a matter of fact," she said, her voice shaking only slightly, "I do." She ignored Julian's stunned silence and the old man's shocked expression. She walked to the employee lockers in the back, her movements stiff and robotic. Her hands trembled as she opened her locker and pulled out her worn handbag. Inside was a small zippered pouch. She opened it and looked at the stack of bank envelopes, the carefully hoarded cash that represented her brother's fragile hope. It felt like tearing out a piece of her own heart. She walked back into the dining room and straight to the register. She unclipped her restaurant-issued payment card from her belt. "I am paying for Table 7's bill," she announced to the cashier, her voice loud enough for Julian to hear clearly, "with my employee discount, and the remainder will be deducted from my upcoming paychecks until it is settled." The employee discount, a privilege for senior staff, would take off 25%. The rest would cripple her. It would take her a year, maybe more, to earn back what she was about to sacrifice. Leo's surgery would be pushed back, his future once again uncertain. She swiped the card. The transaction went through. The receipt printed with a soft, final whir. A receipt for her own financial ruin. She walked back to the table and placed the paid receipt folio in front of the old man. "It's been taken care of, sir," she said softly, avoiding his intense, scrutinizing gaze. "Don't you worry about it." The old man looked from the receipt to her face, his own expression a mixture of astonishment and something else, something deep and analytical. The panic in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, piercing intensity. He seemed to be looking right through her, weighing and measuring the very essence of her soul. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "My father taught me that a meal shared in memory is a sacred thing," Clara replied, the words her father had once said about honoring her late grandmother tumbling out unexpectedly. "It shouldn't be spoiled by something as vulgar as money." She gave him a small, watery smile, turned on her heel and walked away before he could see the tears welling in her eyes. She had just saved a stranger's dignity by sacrificing her brother's future. And as she fled to the relative privacy of the kitchen, she had never felt more alone or more certain that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Julian fired her the next morning. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but a cold, clinical execution. He called her into his office before the start of the lunch shift. "Your behavior last night was a disgrace, Ms. Maeve," he said, not bothering to make eye contact as he straightened a stack of menus on his desk. "This establishment is a business, not a charity ward. Your reckless, emotional decision-making has made you a liability." He slid a final paycheck across the desk. It was a pathetically small amount, the bulk of it already garnished to begin paying off the debt she had incurred. "Your personal effects have been boxed. They are by the service entrance. Do not enter the dining room." Clara took the check without a word. There was nothing to say. Arguing would be pointless. She had known this was coming. Still, the finality of it felt like a physical blow. L'Etoile had been a gilded cage, but it had been a predictable one. Now she was untethered, drifting towards a future that was terrifyingly blank. The next 2 weeks were a descent into a quiet, grinding hell. The city, once a backdrop of glittering possibility, became a landscape of closed doors. She applied for every fine dining position she could find, but the world of high-end hospitality was small and insular. Julian, it seemed, had wasted no time in blackballing her. A friend who still worked at L'Etoile told her that Julian was spreading a story that she had been caught stealing. It was a vicious, career-killing lie, but impossible to fight. Her savings were gone. The small check from Julian was barely enough to cover the rent. To make ends meet, She took a job washing dishes in a greasy, chaotic kitchen of an all-night diner on the other side of town. The work was grueling, the pay abysmal. She went from decanting $1,000 wines to scrubbing hardened egg yolk from plates, the smell of bleach and old grease clinging to her hair and clothes. She told Leo she'd been transferred to the restaurant's daytime shift, a lie that tasted like ash in her mouth. She couldn't bear to see the worry in his eyes. The hospital's letters became more frequent, the red ink of the past due stamps like tiny, accusing wounds. The date for Leo's pre-op consultation came and went. She had to reschedule, blaming it on a work conflict, the lie compounding itself. Despair began to set in, a cold, heavy fog that made it hard to breathe. It was during a particularly bleak Thursday night, her hands raw from hot water and caustic soap, that a new figure appeared in her life. He came not to the diner, but to her apartment building. He was waiting in the bleak, linoleum-floored lobby when she got home just before midnight, exhausted and smelling of fried onions. He was the polar opposite of the old man from the restaurant. Dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, he was perhaps in his late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind a pair of wire-rimmed glasses and an air of quiet authority. "Miss Clara Maeve?" he asked. His voice was deep and resonant, a boardroom voice that had no place in this rundown lobby. Clara's blood ran cold. He had to be a debt collector, or worse, an attorney for the hospital. "Who's asking?" she said, her tone defensive. The man did not smile. He reached into his suit jacket and produced a slim, elegant business card, holding it out to her. The card was made of thick, creamy stock, the lettering embossed in a deep navy blue. Samuel Davies, Senior Counsel, Finch Consolidated Holdings. Clara stared at the card, bewildered. Finch Consolidated was a legend, a global behemoth in shipping, technology, and real estate. Its founder, Alistair Finch, was a reclusive, almost mythical figure, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the world. "I don't understand," she stammered. "What do you want with me?" "Mr. Finch has requested a meeting with you," Davies said, his tone flat and professional. "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. A car will be waiting for you downstairs." "Mr. Finch? Alistair Finch?" Clara felt a wave of dizziness. "Why? What is this about?" "All of your questions will be answered at the meeting," Davies replied, his expression unchanging. "We are prepared to compensate you for your time." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I would advise you to be there. Mr. Finch does not make requests twice." Before she could form another question, he gave a curt nod, turned, and walked out into the night, leaving Clara standing in the dim lobby, the impossible business card clutched in her hand. Her mind was a maelstrom of confusion and a terrifying, ludicrous spark of an idea she barely dared to entertain. The old man, his pale blue eyes, the impossible meal. It couldn't be. It was the stuff of fantasy, and yet the weight of the card in her hand was undeniably real. The car that arrived the next morning was a sleek, black Bentley that hummed so quietly it seemed to float at the curb. It was a vessel from another universe, and as Clara slid onto the buttery, soft leather of the back seat, she felt a profound sense of dislocation. She was wearing her only interview outfit, a simple black dress she'd bought at a thrift store, now meticulously ironed. It felt woefully inadequate. The car glided through the city, eventually pulling up to a skyscraper of black glass and steel that seemed to disappear into the low-hanging clouds. The words Finch Tower were etched in discreet, powerful letters above the entrance. Samuel Davies was waiting for her in the lobby, which was less a room and more a vast, silent cavern of polished marble and modern art. He led her to a private elevator, which ascended with breathtaking, silent speed to the top floor. The doors opened directly into an office that seemed to occupy the entire sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows on three sides offered a god's-eye view of the city sprawling below. A massive desk, carved from a single piece of dark, lustrous wood, sat facing the panorama. The only objects on it were a sleek laptop and a single, framed black-and-white photograph of a beautiful, laughing woman with kind eyes. And sitting behind the desk, framed against the skyline, was him. It was the old man from the diner, yet it was not. The threadbare coat was gone. replaced by a perfectly tailored navy suit. The unkempt hair was now neatly styled, silver gray and distinguished. The weary, defeated slump of his shoulders was gone, replaced by an upright posture of immense power and authority. He moved with a quiet confidence that seemed to command the very air in the room. But the eyes were the same. Pale, piercing blue, they were no longer clouded with age or sadness. They were sharp, clear, and intensely focused on her. Clara stopped dead, her breath catching in her throat. The two images, the frail, shabby patron and this formidable titan of industry, collided in her mind with the force of a physical impact. The lost wallet, the story of his wife, the deliberate, calculated test. A hot wave of fury, born of humiliation, washed over her. She hadn't just been fired, she had been played. Her sacrifice, the thing that had cost her everything, had been nothing more than a rich man's cruel game. "You," she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. The man in the chair did not flinch. He simply held her gaze. "Yes, Ms. Maeve," said Alistair Finch, his voice no longer the dry rasp of an old man, but the rich, commanding baritone of a king in his castle. "It was me. Please sit down. We have a great deal to discuss." Clara remained standing, her fists clenched at her sides. "Discuss what? Your little social experiment? Did you and your friends have a good laugh? Let's see if we can make the poor waitress throw away her life savings for a stranger." Was it entertaining? Alistair Finch's powerful facade seemed to crack for just a moment, revealing a glimpse of the weary man from the restaurant. A deep, genuine sadness filled his eyes. "There was no laughter, Clara," he said quietly, using her first name. It sounded strange, intimate in this vast, cold room. And it was not a game. It was a search. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Please, you have earned more than an explanation. You have earned the truth." Slowly, hesitantly, Clara sank into the chair, her anger still simmering beneath a layer of stunned disbelief. Samuel Davies stood discreetly by the window, a silent witness. "That photograph," Alistair began, nodding toward the picture on his desk, "is of my wife, Eleanor, the woman I was waiting for at the restaurant. She passed away 2 years ago." The grief in his voice was raw and real. "L'Étoile, that table, was where our life together began. The meal I ordered was the meal we shared on our first date 60 years ago." He paused, his gaze lost in the past. "Eleanor was the soul of this company, the soul of my life. She came from nothing. Her father was a dock worker, her mother a seamstress. She never forgot where she came from. She believed that true character wasn't revealed in a boardroom, but in how you treat people who have nothing to offer you in return. It was her mantra." He looked back at Clara. "When she died, the world became gray. I was surrounded by sycophants, by people whose kindness was a currency, a means to an end. My own children," he said with a sigh of profound disappointment, "see my life's work as nothing more than an asset to be liquidated." The silence in the room was a living thing, a vast, pressurized void that seemed to suck the very air from Clara's lungs. Her rage a moment ago, a white-hot nova, flickered and died, leaving behind the cold, heavy ash of comprehension. This wasn't a cruel prank. It was something far more complex, far more devastating, a desperate man's pilgrimage, with her soul as the final, unmapped territory. Alistair Finch's gaze never left hers. In it, she saw not the cunning of a predator, but the profound, hollowed-out weariness of a widower who had lost his faith in the world his wife had so loved. The admission of his investigation into her life, into Leo, should have felt like a violation. Instead, it felt like a confession, a laying down of arms. He had known the exact weight of the cross he was asking her to bear. "You were looking for a saint," she finally whispered, the words catching in her throat. "And you were willing to break a person to find one." The truth of her statement landed between them with the force of a physical blow. A flicker of deep, authentic shame crossed Alistair's face. "Perhaps," he conceded, his voice gravelly, "or perhaps I was just looking for a glimmer of the light I thought was extinguished forever. The world I inhabit is filled with mirrors, Miss Maeve. People who reflect back whatever they think I want to see. Power, wealth, they are insulators. They shield you from truth, from genuine human connection. Eleanor, she was my connection. She saw the person, always, not the portfolio. He gestured again toward the photograph, a simple, unconscious movement of a man still tethered to a ghost. She believed in the quiet transaction of dignity, not as charity, but as the fundamental currency of a decent society. When I lost her, I started to believe she'd been a beautiful anomaly. I feared my life's work would become nothing but a cold monument of acquisitions and balance sheets, a mausoleum to a fortune she never cared for. He took a slow, deliberate breath, composing himself, the titan of industry reasserting control over the grieving husband. So yes, I devised a test, a monstrous, unforgivable test. I put you in an impossible position. I wanted to be proven wrong, but I fully expected my cynicism to be validated. I expected you to call the manager, to protect your job, to make the sensible choice. Every rational metric said you would. He leaned forward, his pale eyes burning with the memory of that night. But you didn't, Clara. You looked at a broken old man, and you didn't see a liability. You didn't see a threat to your livelihood. You saw a human being whose honor was being stripped from him, and you decided that was a price too high for anyone to pay. You defended my dignity at the cost of your own future. In that moment, you weren't a waitress. You were the wealthiest person in that room, and Julian Vance was the pauper. The raw sincerity of his words began to dismantle the last of her defenses. This wasn't about a job offer. This was about a legacy. This was about the continuation of a love story, and he was asking her to be its next chapter. He slid a thick, leather-bound portfolio across the vast expanse of the desk. It stopped a few inches from her trembling hands. It was navy blue with simple, elegant gold lettering, the Eleanor Finch Legacy Initiative. My children and my board of directors will inherit an empire, Alistair said, his voice now imbued with a steely resolve. They will manage the assets, the shipping lanes, the real estate. They understand numbers, but they do not understand value. Eleanor's legacy, our true legacy, cannot be quantified on a stock ticker. It must be lived. It must be nurtured. He tapped the portfolio. The Finch Foundation, as it exists, is a tax shelter with a PR department. It's soulless. We are dissolving it. This initiative is its replacement. It will not be a foundation that writes checks to galas. Its mandate will be to identify and empower the boat builders, as Eleanor called them. The people who, against all odds, choose to build something better, rather than just patch the leaks. It will invest in character, not just in projects. Its initial endowment will be $2 billion. Clara stared at the words on the cover, the number echoing in the silent room like a cannon shot. It was an abstraction, a figure so immense it had no connection to reality as she knew it. A leader of such an entity cannot be a person who has only read about hardship in a sociology textbook. Alistair continued, his gaze intense. It cannot be another Ivy League graduate who thinks poverty is a puzzle to be solved with algorithms. It needs a heart that has been tested. It needs hands that know the reality of thankless work. It needs a leader who understands in their very bones that giving a person a check can save their month, but restoring their dignity can save their life. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. It needs you, Clara. I am not offering you a job. I am offering you a mission. I want you to be the inaugural executive director. You will report directly to me and only to me. You will build your team from the ground up. You will define the agenda. You will have the resources to find the other Claras of this world and give them the leverage they need to move their part of it. A choked, hysterical laugh escaped her lips. Mr. Finch, I serve scallops. I scrub grease off plates. I know how to fold a napkin 17 different ways. I don't know how to run a multi-billion-dollar initiative. You know how to see people, he countered, his voice unwavering. That is the one skill I can't teach, and it is the only one that truly matters for this role. I can hire lawyers, accountants, investment managers. They will work for you. They will be your tools. But you, Clara, you are the architect. Your life has been your education. He seemed to sense her reeling. the sheer vertigo of his proposal threatening to overwhelm her. He softened his tone, his voice becoming gentle, paternal. And as for the more immediate matters, the initiative's charter allows for discretionary, preemptive action. Its first action, which Mr. Davies executed this morning, was to establish an irrevocable medical trust in the name of Leo Mave. The chief of cardiac surgery at Massachusetts General is leading his team. They are expecting him next week. Every cost, every treatment, every follow-up for the rest of his life is covered. He will have the future he deserves. That was it. The final devastating blow. Not of a weapon, but of grace. The fear for Leo had been a part of her cellular makeup for so long, a cold, hard stone in her gut that she had learned to live around. To hear that it was gone. Just like that. The relief was so immense, so violent, it felt like grief. The tears she had held back finally broke free, silent and hot, tracing paths of disbelief and gratitude down her face. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had carried trays and polished silver, the nails short and practical. She thought of her father and his belief in the stories objects told. She thought of her mother whose quiet strength had held their family together. She thought of Leo, his fierce, protective love for her. All of her life, she had been a custodian of other people's memories, dreams, and needs. Now someone was asking her to be the architect of a new kind of future. It was terrifying. It was absurd. It was the most important thing anyone had ever asked her to do. She took a ragged breath, meeting Alistair Finch's steady gaze across the polished expanse of wood and ambition. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand, a gesture more suited to a diner kitchen than a penthouse office. "All right, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice small but clear. "Where do we begin?" The first week was an exercise in surreal dislocation. Clara felt like a ghost haunting someone else's life. The world of Finch, consolidated, operated on a different temporal plane, one of quiet, humming efficiency. Samuel Davies, a man who communicated in perfectly formed, legally sound paragraphs, became her reluctant Virgil, guiding her through the bewildering circles of this new inferno. He escorted her to a corner office 2 floors below Alistair's. It was larger than her entire apartment, with a view that made the city look like a beautiful, intricate circuit board. A wardrobe curated by an anonymous stylist was waiting for her in a private adjoining room, filled with tailored suits and silk blouses in muted, powerful colors. They felt like a costume. Each morning, she felt like she was dressing up for a part in a play she hadn't rehearsed. Her first call to Leo was a masterpiece of evasion and overwhelming love. He was delirious with the news about the Boston clinic, his questions tumbling over one another. "How, Clara? Who are these people? Did you win the lottery?" Something like that, she'd managed, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a new job, Leo. A very complicated one. I'm working for a philanthropic group. They heard about our situation. Just focus on getting well. That's my only job right now." Lying to him felt like a betrayal, but the truth was too vast, too unbelievable to convey over the phone. The real education began in a sterile boardroom with Alistair and a team of silver-haired lawyers. They presented her with the initiative's legal framework, a document thicker than a dictionary, filled with terms like endowment yield parameters, fiduciary responsibility, and non-correlated asset allocation. The words swam before her eyes, a foreign language she couldn't parse. She sat in silence for 2 hours, gripping a pen, her knuckles white, feeling the crushing weight of her own inadequacy. Julian Vance's sneering voice echoed in her memory. A liability. That afternoon, Alistair found her staring out her office window, the city lights beginning to blur through unshed tears of frustration. "They think I'm a fool," she said without turning around. "They think you're an unknown quantity," Alistair corrected gently, coming to stand beside her, "and it makes them nervous." "Good. The world is changed by unknown quantities, not by predictable ones." He pointed to the portfolio she'd left untouched on her new desk. "Forget their jargon for a moment. That is a rule book. It is not the mission. Let me ask you a question. If you had the power to do one thing right now to prevent what happened to you from happening to someone else, what would it be?" The question cut through the fog of corporate speak. It was direct. It was human. Clara thought of the frantic, sleepless nights, the terror of the red-stamped envelopes, the shame of having to ask for an extension. "I'd pay the rent," she said simply. "When a family gets a catastrophic medical diagnosis, the whole world stops. But the bills don't. The eviction notices don't. The crisis isn't just the illness. It's the 100 little humiliations that come with it. It's the fear of losing your home while you're fighting for your life. I'd create a fund. No long applications, no invasive questions, just a bridge, a way to keep a family's dignity intact so they can focus on healing." A long silence followed. Clara was sure she had said something naive, something laughably simplistic. But when she finally looked at Alistair, he was smiling. It was the first genuine, unguarded smile she had seen from him. "The Dignity Bridge Fund," he said, tasting the words. "That will be our first project. Samuel will draft the parameters. You will oversee its creation. Don't tell me about tax efficacy. Tell me how it will feel to the person on the other end of the phone call. That is your job." It was the key. Her past was not a liability. It was her expertise. Her empathy was not a weakness. It was her compass. The following weeks were a blur of intense, focused work. She fought with the legal team to simplify the application process, arguing for trust over suspicion. She worked with a small tech team to design a secure, private portal for social workers and hospital advocates to submit requests. She was building the very thing she had so desperately needed. She was no longer playing a part. She was writing the script. 2 months later, Clara found herself back at L'Etoile. The restaurant was a glittering, humming jewel box, unchanged. But she had changed. She wore a simple, elegant navy dress, her posture straight, her movements confident. She was not there for revenge. Alistair had requested they meet there, a quiet act of closing a circle. She was seated at table 7, her table. She ordered a sparkling water and waited. The new manager, a woman with a strained, professional smile, treated her with the detached reverence reserved for the wealthy. The waiters who had been her colleagues now avoided her eyes, whispering behind their hands. Then she saw him, Julian Vance. He was no longer the manager, but a glorified maître d', his demotion palpable in his stiff, resentful posture. He spotted her, and his face contorted in a mask of disbelief and contempt. He strode towards her table, his polished shoes clicking in angry rhythm on the marble floor. "I don't know what game you're playing, Maeve, but I want you out. We have standards here." Clara looked up at him, and what she felt was not anger, but a profound and weary pity. "Hello, Julian," she said, her voice calm and even. "That's Mr. Vance to you. Now get out before I call security." "That won't be necessary," said a quiet voice. Samuel Davies had appeared, materializing silently beside the table. He placed a slim briefcase on the empty chair. "Miss Maeve is here as a guest of the building's new owners." Julian blanched, his gaze flicking from Samuel's immaculately tailored suit to Clara's serene face. "New owners?" "The building was acquired last week by a real estate subsidiary of Finch Consolidated," Samuel stated, his tone flat and factual. He opened the briefcase and produced a single, thick document. "This is a notice of lease termination for the current occupants, effective in 90 days. The new owners have different plans for the space." Julian stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. His carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. He looked at Clara, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. "You? This was you?" he stammered. Clara simply held his gaze. There was no triumph in her expression, only a quiet finality. "My father taught me that the soul of a restaurant is its hospitality, Julian," she said softly. "Not its wine list. This place, it's beautiful, but it has no soul. It's a stage for a play about wealth. We're going to give it a purpose." She stood up, her movement graceful and assured. "We're turning it into a tuition-free culinary institute, a place for young people from forgotten neighborhoods to learn a craft, to build a future. A place where the first thing on the menu is opportunity and the second is dignity." She looked past him at the opulent room, seeing not what it was, but what it would become. She heard not the clinking of crystal, but the boisterous laughter of students. She smelled not truffles and beeswax, but baking bread and simmering stock. She turned to leave but paused, looking back at the shattered man. "There's a diner on 57th and Vine," she said, her voice devoid of malice. "They're always looking for dishwashers. It's honest work. It teaches you things." It wasn't an insult. It was the simplest truth she knew, and with that, she walked away, leaving Julian Vance alone in the wreckage of his gilded cage. 6 months later, the cage was gone. Clara stood with Alistair in the cavernous, stripped-bare space of the former L'Etoile. The chandeliers were down, the velvet banquettes hauled away, the air thick with the clean, promising scent of sawdust and plaster. Sunlight, unfiltered and honest, streamed through the towering windows. A young crew, the first class of apprentices, was busy helping contractors frame the new training kitchens. Alistair, dressed in a simple cashmere sweater and worn corduroys, handed her a steaming mug of coffee from a thermos. He looked more like the man she had first met than the billionaire in the tower. He looked content. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked, his pale eyes watching her. "The quiet order of it all. The performance?" Clara looked around at the controlled chaos, at the hopeful, energetic faces of the young apprentices. She thought of the fear she used to carry, the gnawing anxiety that had been her constant companion. She remembered the feeling of being invisible, a ghost servicing the whims of people who never saw her. "I don't miss the silence," she said, taking a sip of the strong black coffee. "There's more life in this dust than there ever was in the quiet of that dining room." She looked at the old man who had become her mentor, her partner, her friend. "That night, when I paid for your meal, I was so sure I had made a fatal mistake. I thought my compassion was a character flaw, an extravagance I couldn't afford." She turned from the panorama of construction to face him, her eyes clear and filled with a strength that was forged, not feigned. "I see now it wasn't a flaw. It was the only real thing I had. It wasn't a sacrifice. It was an affirmation. You didn't give me a new life, Alistair. You just cleared away all the things that were stopping me from living the one that was mine all along." Alistair Finch smiled, a warmth reaching his eyes that had nothing to do with wealth or power. It was the look of a man who had finally brought his wife's legacy home. "Eleanor would have loved you, Clara," he said quietly. Outside, the city hummed its relentless, indifferent song. But inside, amidst the skeletal framework of a new beginning, a different kind of music was starting to play. It was the sound of hammers and saws, of shouted instructions and easy laughter. It was the sound of boat builders at work, forever bound by the memory of a sacred meal, and the quiet, revolutionary truth that the greatest fortune one can possess is the dignity you are willing to give away.